Good morning and welcome to OSW Daily, where each day we discuss the key trending work-related topics with industry experts and thought leaders. Today's no different, so we're looking forward to digging into this today. If this is your first time coming across the channel, thank you. I hope you find this valuable. I hope you find it useful. And so who am I? My name is Steve Todd. I'm Global Head of Workplace at NASDAQ, and I'm also the founder of opensourceworkplace.com. So what are we going to talk about today? So let's pull up today's agenda. Today we're going to talk about the legal impact a vaccine may have for employers and employees, and workers' compensation and employer liability. With the news of the vaccine, I'm sure a lot of folks are interested to hear what actually legal guidance we can receive. Today, to do that, we have an industry expert, Alexandra Romero, who is a labor and employment lawyer at Aaron Fox. So, Alexandra, come on in. Welcome to OSW Daily.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for having me.
No, my pleasure. It's great to have you here. And we were just chatting beforehand, with the various news coming out this week. It's been a very busy week for you, and I'm sure. But before we dig into that, Alexandra, what should the audience know about you?
Absolutely. So I am a labor and employment attorney at the law firm of Aaron Fox. My practice is very much generalized. I deal with every single type of issue that employers can face in the workplace. And, as I'm sure people can imagine during the pandemic, that experience has implicated a whole host of different employment considerations from, dealing with, workplace safety issues, employee leave issues, and just the whole gamut of the types of issues that come up in the work environment. So it's been a busy time.
I'm sure it has. I'm sure it has. So how did you get into law? I'm just curious to know that little bit of background.
Got it. Well, like a lot of lawyers, I had a liberal arts degree in political science, which is not as marketable as one might think. So I started thinking about opportunities after college and ended up as a paralegal at a law firm and ended up surprisingly liking it, reaffirming my decision to go to law school. And that's not always the way it works out for people.
No, that's so true. That's so true. Now you're based in DC, right? So DC, we know what the commute's like. So how are you feeling about this remote working from home at this time from that aspect?
hmm Yeah, so I have to say I'm one of the people. I'm sure there are at least a couple more out there who have actually really enjoyed the work from home environment. It's nice to have a little bit more time at the beginning and end of the day when you're typically sitting in a car stuck in traffic, and so not having to deal with that has been a real plus.
No, I think a lot of people out there can attest. I think you've been very polite when you say a few people, but but so obviously, so this week the vaccine news come out, right? And I'm sure that you've had a few calls this week. So really, what I want to really go through today is sort of looking at what are some of those questions that you're receiving, and there's questions and conversations that I know I've certainly been involved in that I think a lot of people are looking for some guidance, and I just want to put that disclaimer out there. You're not giving legal advice here. This is just an opinion, and I just want people to be aware of that because no two people's or two companies instance is very much the same. So I just want to sort of throw that out there. So Alexandra, don't feel that people are going to, so you said this on OSW Daily. So I just want to throw that out there.
Mhm.
But so, I mean, how have people reacted to the news this week?
Yeah, so it's obviously very promising and exciting news. And so I'm as you've said, you've received a lot of questions about this. I've been receiving a lot of questions about this from clients trying to figure out what the implications are of a vaccine. And the attitude has been really, really positive. There's a big hope that this will allow a lot of businesses that have had their operations, curtailed for going on 6 months now, that it'll offer them a path back to kind of normalcy. So that all looks very promising. And then I've been getting a lot of questions that I know we're going to talk about whether or not once a vaccine becomes available, and at this point it really seems like it's a question of when, not if. Once a vaccine becomes kind of widely available, what should employers be doing in terms of policies either requiring employees to get vaccinated or whether that's something that they should stay away from. So, that's a very complicated question. And it's interesting because the idea that an employer could require employees to get a vaccine feels like it's an entirely brand new issue, but it's actually not. This is something that employers, particularly in the healthcare industry, have been requiring employees to do for some time. For example, if you have people providing patient care, there are a lot of healthcare employers who require those employees to get flu shots each year. So this is an issue that's come up before. It's one that the various agencies that deal with employment issues have faced before. And so on this big question, can an employer require employees to get a COVID-19 vaccine? The answer, as it looks right now, is generally yes. They can require employees to do that, but there are a couple of important caveats because federal employment laws and state and local laws that are similar require employers to provide religious and disability-related accommodations. So, for example, if you have an employee whose religious beliefs preclude them from taking any type of a vaccine, there are circumstances in which an employer has to accommodate that employee's sincerely held religious beliefs. And similarly, if are employees with a certain type of disability or medical condition that makes them intolerant to a vaccine or could be contraindicated for their particular condition, that's another circumstance where employers, depending on the facts of each individual situation, may have to accommodate an employee who does not want to get a COVID-19 vaccine.
That's really interesting. I didn't think that an employer could. It makes sense. And obviously, with the precedent being set there within the health industry, I'm sure a few people are scratching their heads going, well, that's interesting. So what happens if an employee who maybe perhaps say for the two reasons you thought, for political or for health reasons, right? Or not political, religion, sorry, didn't want to. Is there an instance where they wouldn't be allowed back into the workplace?
Yeah. So in these types of scenarios, oftentimes it really does come down to the specific facts of an individual situation. So it's hard to make generalizations, but the analysis typically kind of flows like this. Employers have to provide religious and disability-based accommodation, unless doing so would result in an undue hardship to the organization. So under certain circumstances, accommodations are required, but if you get to a certain point where the impacts of that accommodation are too great, then the employer doesn't have to provide an accommodation. So an example of a situation where it would probably be more likely that an employer would be able to show an undue burden. Think again of a healthcare worker, someone who's in a hospital, who's treating patients. That's a situation where I think it would be much more likely that an employer would be able to require that employee to get a vaccine. And if they're unwilling to, then to engage in some type of employment action, either barring them from the workplace or maybe even proceeding to termination if there's no other work that would be available to them. If you're looking at a typical office worker, maybe someone whose job allows them to work from home, that's a situation where, it would probably be more likely that an employer would not be able to show that accommodating that employee's belief would be unduly burdensome, because there are other ways that you could still maintain the safety of your workplace, other arrangements. And so there it would be much harder to allow an employer to enforce a uniform mandatory vaccination policy without, making any type of an accommodation. So it really does depend on the specific facts and circumstances. And I think what we're more likely to see moving forward is that for most employers, rather than having a mandatory vaccination policy, instead just having, employers strongly encourage employees to get a vaccine, kind of the way we see now with flu shots. My firm, every fall, they send out, reminder emails about how flu shots are available, and sometimes even bring someone in on site to provide flu shots. It's unclear with the COVID-19 vaccine and the circumstances in which it has to be stored, whether that's something that would be viable for your typical employer. But there are a lot of unknowns, and it could be that that's the way, kind of the middle ground that employers find moving forward to take steps to obviously ensure the safety of their workplace and their employees, but without, kind of getting involved in these more tricky issues involving accommodations.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously in the US we have the HIPAA regulations, right? So how does that then come into play? Does the employees have to disclose, do you think, or will it be a voluntary disclosure? Again, I know we're getting into some things that
Mhm.
you really probably haven't fully fleshed out, but these are the questions that sort of I'm certainly having with other people.
Mhm. Yeah. So the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, is the agency that enforces most federal anti-discrimination laws, including the ADA, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the statute that prohibits disability discrimination. And the EEOC has characterized COVID-19 as what's called a direct threat, meaning that it presents a clear risk of substantial harm to employees. And under those circumstances, have a lot more leeway than they otherwise would to require testing and implement policies intended to ensure the safety of their workplace. So generally speaking, if an employer implements a mandatory vaccination policy, they would be able to take steps necessary to ensure that employees are complying with it, which would mean that employees would have an obligation to disclose to their employers if they've received the vaccine. There are still limitations on what employers can do with that kind of health knowledge. That information would have to be kept confidential, limited to only those people with a business-related reason to know. But under these circumstances, I think there is a lot more leeway for employers to take the steps that they need to make sure that their workplace is safe.
And obviously with a lot of these things, there's no consistency country to country around the world, right? And with many global organizations, how are they thinking about that right now? Are they just looking at different jurisdictions as how you think or would sort of you think organizations will look at this?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and it's certainly been a challenge for a lot of multinational employers. It's even been a challenge just for employers here in the U.S. who have employees based in different states, different jurisdictions that have taken different approaches to, lockdowns and mandatory work from home orders. It's required a lot of legwork to really stay up to date on what that guidance has been coming from the different governmental entities here in the States and around the world. So that I think is something that employers are going to continue to have to do. And it's something that we've been emphasizing because this guidance has been changing. There have been different approaches taken by different jurisdictions. So it's really important to have someone or a team of people who are specifically tasked with monitoring the changing guidance and making sure that you're compliant in all the different jurisdictions where you may have employees.
So we talked about, like, you probably received a lot of questions. Which questions have really scratched your head this week? Because I'm sure you got some really good ones.
Yeah, so a lot of them have been focused on the vaccine and particularly the timing of the vaccine and how that may impact planning for the coming year. For example, we've certainly seen some companies that have gone to complete work from home, even after the course of the pandemic has run its course. They were anticipating that they would still be keeping their employees completely remote full time, just based on the lack of certainty about when we would be getting out of the woods. And so I think there have been some people who have started to revisit those policies, rethink them in the face of a vaccine that could be widely distributed sometime in the first half of next year.
That's interesting how it's shifting people's mindsets, right? It's
Mhm.
one of the things it's done is provided a little bit of certainty in a very
Mhm.
uncertain, unstable environment. So that is really a positive. But it's interesting as well the impact how it is shifting leadership mindset as well.
Absolutely, and you're absolutely right that it's starting to provide a little bit of certainty that makes planning easier,
Hmm.
particularly heading to the end of the calendar year. People are thinking about budgets, they're thinking about strategic plans, and the idea that we'll have a much more kind of stable situation sometime relatively soon, fingers crossed, is definitely helpful to those efforts.
So what happens in that, that horrible situation where an employee contracts COVID-19 and it's attributed to the work environment. How does that play out from a legal perspective?
Yeah, so this has been an ongoing question that employers of all sizes have had to face since the beginning of the pandemic. And there's a lot of guidance, both from the CDC here in the US at the federal level and also from various state agencies about what employers should do if that happens. And the first and most immediate thing to do as a best practice is really to kind of engage in your own contact tracing. You want to talk to the employee, you want to see um, figure out if they've been in the workplace during a time when they could have exposed other employees, and if so, who they've had contact with, so that you can go to those people, let them know that they've potentially had an exposure and that they should be talking to their medical professional about whether or not they need to get tested, and then making sure that those people who did have close contact with the employee who tested positive self-quarantine for the recommended period of time. And that's really the important part, is that you make sure you identify who else could have had contact, and then keep those people out of the workplace for as long as possible to ensure that they have not contracted the illness themselves. And so that way you don't have a situation where employees are coming to work who've been exposed and are potentially spreading the virus, possibly unbeknownst to anybody because they're asymptomatic, to other employees. And OSHA, which is the agency that really enforces workplace safety issues, does not have a specific standard for COVID-19, but they do have a general requirement that employers are required to make sure their workplace is free from recognized hazards to the extent feasible. And so taking those steps to limit the spread of the virus once there's someone within the workplace who's tested positive is really essential to ensuring that you're not facing a situation where other employees are potentially exposed.
And how do you think then with a vaccine environment, does that shift anything? Because in essence, employees could go in, they have a vaccine, so therefore there could be more exposure. Do you think that changes the narrative or the interpretation further?
I think it will. It's hard to know, what the timeline is for when a vaccine could really become widely available, where you would anticipate or expect that many or, even most or all of your employees have received the vaccine. So in the long term, I do think that is a bit of a game changer and will, change what employers are obligated to do. But in the short term, as the vaccine starts getting rolled out, as the distribution process is still getting ramped up, where employers can't necessarily expect that an employee would have had the opportunity to get vaccinated, they'll still want to keep those types of workplace safety policies in place and make sure they're adhering to them until we get to a point where the vaccine is widely available.
And you mentioned that before we come on, employees' right to refuse dangerous work. Would that be considered an environment, those people who maybe have the vaccine, who maybe may display symptoms, would that be considered dangerous work for those people who maybe haven't had the vaccine?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Under the Occupational Safety and Health Act, which is the main statute that OSHA enforces, have a right to refuse to engage in work that is unduly dangerous without fear of retaliation. And that, as the statute has been interpreted, is a really high bar for employees to meet in order to show that they have a right to refuse work. They have to show that there is an imminent risk of serious injury or even death. They have to show that they approached their employer about unsafe conditions, asked for the employer to correct it, and the employer didn't do anything. And only after they do that do they have the right to engage in refusing to perform that work. So it's complicated, but whenever you have a situation where employees are afraid of performing or engaging in their work out of safety concerns, that's something you always want to take really seriously. And you always want to explore if there are other opportunities or ways that you can make the workplace safer or put your employees' minds at ease. And so that's always a step that it'll be important for employers to take, even in a situation where we do have widespread use of a vaccine.
And obviously in the workplace, there's a lot more than just employees in the environment, right? There are visitors, there are third-party contractors. How should companies be thinking about that as well?
Yeah, so in terms of purely legal obligations, employers obviously have a much heightened responsibility towards their own employees as opposed to guests in their workplace. That being said, as a matter of best practice, we do encourage employers to engage in a lot of the same steps that they would take with employees with third-party visitors to their workplace where feasible. So, for example, if you're a company and you have a relationship with a vendor and they have certain of the vendor's employees in your workplace on a regular basis, and you become aware that they've been exposed to one of your own employees who tested positive, obviously you want to take steps there to make the vendor employer aware of the situation so that they can fulfill their obligations to their employees. But there are certain circumstances where it's not possible to do that. Think a retail store or a restaurant. One of your workers tests positive for COVID-19, obviously that's a situation where it's really much more difficult to engage in any kind of contract tracing or figure out who may have been exposed. So it really does depend on the circumstance. But even with third parties in the workplace, it is still, as a matter of best practice, a good idea to take a lot of the steps that you're taking with employees.
And how does this then fall into the disability discrimination rules? Does this impact it, do you think, further, or what's your view on that?
Yeah, so there are, what are called public accommodations laws that prohibit disability discrimination in places of public accommodation, like stores, like restaurants, hotels, things along those lines. The rules are a little bit different, but it is an interesting question, and it's still one that's a little bit open at this point, I think, particularly in the context of a vaccine. Can a store or a restaurant bar customers who have not received a vaccine? And actually, I saw a headline yesterday that Ticketmaster is going to be requiring people who purchase tickets for concerts through their service to provide some type of a proof that they have received a vaccine before they're allowed to purchase the ticket. And I was very interested to see that. That does seem very novel, and it'll be interesting to see how it plays out and how the policy that they're actually going to be able to enforce.
And I was going to say, how do they know, right? So someone ticks a box. How do you know, right? And there's an expectation then. If you've asked that question, someone's filled that out, then there is potential for repercussion if someone else goes along and contracts the virus at the concert then. Do they hold themselves liable in that
Yeah, so it's really interesting. I will have to see what type of proof, if any, Ticketmaster is going to be requiring, or if they really are just, requiring people to check a box on an online fillable form. I don't know. It'll be really, really informative to see how that plays out. In terms of liability, I think at this point, obviously the risks of the virus are known pretty widely. The risks of, attending closed, inside gatherings with a heavy concentration of people, those risks are known. So in terms of liability for Ticketmaster, I think that under, just very general circumstances would be a hard case to make. But I'll be following and seeing what their policy ends up looking like.
And I think it's good from a human specific thing, right? There's certainty. If you're going to an event, then okay, there are always going to be those people that don't play ball, right? But at least
Mm-hmm.
what the intent is and the spirit of which everybody else should be buying and purchasing a ticket. So it'll be interesting to see how that unfolds. Do you think that's going to be rolled out into other environments, like sporting events and, I don't know, shopping malls, things like that? Can you see that sort of thing happening too?
Yeah, I think I can see that happening. I think that one of the nice benefits of that type of a policy is that it gives people a level of confidence, which then translates into much more of a willingness to actually return to these public areas. And for all of the employers who provide goods and services to the public, restaurants, you know, all types of venues, having a general population that has that level of comfort that they're not going to be or less likely to be exposing themselves if they actually venture out again into the world will provide, I think, a level of comfort both for customers and for the businesses who are really hoping that a vaccine results in a pickup in, the kind of foot traffic and activities that they really rely on.
And so, as we sort of think about this and we sort of wrap this up, what other things are going through your head? Because obviously your legal mind is sort of looking at this in all different ways, right? So anyone listening right now, what sort of things should they be asking themselves as they prepare for this?
Yeah, so I think one of the still outstanding questions is what happens, what kind of liability will you face if you are some type of a public employer and someone claims that they contracted COVID-19 in your business? That is a topic that has been batted around up on Capitol Hill as a provision to include in future COVID-19 relief packages some type of a liability shield for businesses, so that they don't have to worry about the threat of lawsuits that could be, financially ruinous just from the cost of having to defend them, let alone what the ultimate outcome is. We haven't seen any movement on that, but it is still a topic and still a priority for some members up on the Hill. I think that that risk is always present, but COVID-19 presents some really challenging circumstances regarding whether or not potential plaintiffs would be able to establish liability, because it can be very difficult to figure out and determine where someone actually contracted a virus and what circumstances allowed that to happen. And so that's an essential element that any plaintiff would have to prove in some type of a lawsuit is causation. They have to show that the defendant actually did something to cause their injury. And with COVID-19 cases, I think that could be a very challenging element for potential plaintiffs to establish.
Yeah, one has to think because of if there was one ruling in one way, then there may be an avalanche, and who knows how industry could cope with that. So as we wrap up, any final thoughts?
Well, I think, like everybody, the past week has been very exciting news on the vaccine front. I know that one of the biggest challenges in the pandemic so far has been this lack of certainty. And hopefully we're moving to a place where we start to get a little bit more of a handle on the timeline for returning to normal life.
Absolutely, absolutely. Alexandra, look, thank you. I appreciate it. I appreciate your time this morning. We have put links so people can connect with you, and also some of the articles that you shared with me, the OSHA and Aaron Fox, some of the blogs that you guys have prepared. So there is links on that. So folks, please do reach out to Alexandra with questions. As I said, this is not legal advice, and this is just a conversation. And there's some very interesting things that we were able to touch on today. So Alexandra, thank you for being so open to have the conversation, understanding there's that much uncertainty around the whole area. So thank you. Best of luck, and I look forward to chatting with you soon.
Absolutely.